It is the return of the annual best and worst case scenarios off-season series. Today we focus on Chris Kreider. What is the ceiling and what is the floor for the longest tenured New York Ranger? Plus, Matt Rempe graduates from Georges Laraque's fighting school.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1117 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, yeah, I mentioned just a second ago, we're basically bringing back what has become an annual tradition here on Locked On New York Rangers. Basically, we just take a look at the entire roster, at least what we think will be the opening night roster for the New York Rangers. We look at every single player, and we just go through the entire roster throughout the offseason, off and on throughout the entire offseason, and discuss what are the best case scenarios and what are the worst case scenarios for every single player. And for today, I thought we could go ahead, hone in on Chris Kreider, obviously the longest tenured New York Ranger and somebody that is slated to open the season as the top line left wing. And I know a lot of people are going to point out that the Panarin line has basically become the top line for the Rangers. I agree. But for the purposes of just staying consistent here and going with what the Rangers go with when they, release their line combinations, they always have that listed as a top line. So we're going to stick with that. We'll start with the worst case scenarios, and we will finish with the best case scenarios. Always best to do it that way, regardless of what player we're talking about, and end on the positives. So worst case scenario, I would say, in a worst case scenario for Chris Kreider, you get some so-so play at even strength. I think we know when it comes to special teams, Chris Kreider is going to bring it. He's going to be a really important part of what the Rangers do, both on the power play and on the penalty kill. Both units in the top three last year in the regular season, and for the most part, bringing it in the playoffs as well. And I don't want to sit here and make it sound like, Kreider and his line mates, him and Mika and whoever was on the right wing on any given night were this tremendous liability at 5v5. Some Ranger fans would definitely opine that. I don't see it that way at all. But I do think that when it comes to offense specifically at 5v5, it's fair to expect just a little bit more out of Kreider and Mika Zibanejad, given, their status around the league, how long they've been around, how much money they pull in per season, and the fact that this is a cup contending Ranger team, and they need their top players to be their top players and produce offensively. I mean, look, anybody can go through a scoring slump, but they need them to bring it, more often than not. So with all that said, though, I do want to say this. I do want to at least somewhat debunk the power play merchant theory here as it pertains to, when we're talking about Kreider, so we'll focus on him today. So, because you do hear that. You do hear Ranger fans saying, oh, it's only on the power play. That's the only time he scores. That's the only time he gets points, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. So listen to these stats. In his career for Chris Kreider, 185 goals at even strength, 110 goals on the power play, 9 shorthanded goals for the record. And then as far as assists are concerned, it's even more lopsided, 182 assists at even strength, 63 assists on the power play, 3 shorthanded assists. So almost 3 times as many even strength assists as power play assists. So clearly, this is somebody that does get the job done at 5v5. However, again, with all that said, there were a few too many times this past season I felt, and maybe some of you guys felt that way as well. I mean, I know there's certain Ranger fans that felt this way. That, there were certain nights where that line just didn't really do enough offensively, just didn't look dangerous enough, didn't create enough scoring chances, for certain stretches of the season. And again, I don't want to make it sound like that was the case for 82 games, because that's not true either. That's not even close to being true. But there were a few too many of those sort of nothing games, at least from an offensive perspective, from Kreider and the rest of the Ranger top line. So I think in a worst case scenario, you get a little bit more of this, decent play at even strength, but nothing to really write home about. Certainly not elite play at even strength from Chris Kreider, but really that entire line. The other big thing that I have here as far as Chris Kreider in a worst case scenario is that maybe his speed starts to decline a little bit. Now, again, I will say right off the top here, I've seen no evidence that that is currently happening. Kreider tends to look really explosive on rushes into the zone, and certainly anytime he gets a breakaway, nobody's catching Kreider. He's going to explode past everybody. Even if, certain instances where maybe the defenseman is there and you would think that he might be able to stop Kreider from getting to the net, but, Kreider just kind of hits the jets and gets toward the net the way that he has to do. But bottom line, I haven't seen any, evidence of Kreider's speed declining. He can still fly, but as we know, father time catches everybody. And at a certain point in the career of every NHL player, they're not going to be as fast as they once were. Now, Kreider is only 33, just turned 33 years old, so I don't think you're going to see his speed fall off a cliff at any point, but will he remain in that kind of like elite tier of, fast NHL skaters? That remains to be seen. I still think for sure, he'll be a fast player. Will he be at the truly elite level? We'll see what happens this upcoming season. But it's interesting because he's out there now, obviously, at least the way it looks right now, it'll be him and Mika and probably Reilly Smith. And Reilly Smith has good speed as well. So that could be fun, seeing the two of them on rushes into the zone. They might be able to link up for some good goals and some dangerous looks on the rush. But, again, in a worst case scenario, Kreider maybe no longer has that high level speed, but is still, a faster player. And for a Ranger team that, I certainly don't think is slow, but they don't have a ton of speed demons either. It's basically like Kreider, and I would say Hedel, if he's healthy. And my understanding is Smith has good speed as well. But yeah, I mean, you certainly want somebody like Kreider, where that's been one of his big time attributes over the years. You want that to continue being the case for Kreider going into next season. So yeah, those are the worst case scenarios. Not a whole lot there. Kreider, you pretty much know what you're getting with him at this point. But in just a second, we're going to shift our attention to the best case scenarios for Chris Kreider for this upcoming season. And like I said, we're going to conclude today's episode talking a little bit about Matt Rempe and the work that he did with Georges Laraque, working on his fighting technique. And we're going to do all that fun stuff in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at all the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home those huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. All right, we just want to take a minute to thank the everydayers, as always, for checking out the Locked On New York Ranger podcast. You guys are definitely going to want to stick around through the rest of the offseason, right into the preseason and the regular season, of course, as well. Going to be doing a lot more of this, just taking a look at all the players in the Ranger roster, the best case and worst case scenarios for all of those players. We've also got our special crossover edition with Locked On Red Wings coming out a little bit later this week. A lot to talk about there with all the former Rangers now in Detroit. And, of course, the Jacob Trouba trade that never was. A lot to discuss with those guys. Always fun doing crossovers with Locked On Red Wings. They're good dudes. So, yep, we'll keep everything rolling here. We're going to keep the focus for the time being on Chris Kreider. Best case scenario, I mentioned this a minute ago, but obviously he's the longest tenured Rangers now. Parts of, I was going to say 12 seasons with the Rangers, but if you include his playoff debut right after, he got done winning a national championship in college, he debuted with the Rangers in the playoffs that year. Technically, he's been a part of this team for 13 seasons now, and this will be year number 14 for Chris Kreider. So I think in a best case scenario, Chris Kreider just does more of what Chris Kreider does. The good stuff, of course. Dominant net front presence, somebody that just cannot be moved out of there, somebody that is absolutely lethal on those redirections. And that's a skill that, Kreider is going to get older like every player does, and eventually, he'll start slowing down in certain aspects of his game. I don't think we're there yet. Again, he did just turn 33. It's not like he's 38 or 39 and on his last legs here. But that's one skill that I don't think is going to go anywhere, because the size is never going to go away. The strength is never going to go away. And there are people that at times will, criticize Kreider for not sticking his nose in there the way that maybe he's capable of. And I totally understand that. But one thing I don't think you can take away is that he does set up shop in front of the net, and he refuses to be moved out of there. I mean, how many goals does he score every season on the redirections? He's just absolutely lethal in that area of the game. And in a best case scenario, and I have no reason to think this won't happen, he'll continue to do exactly that, dominate in front of the net and, score on a lot of those redirections. Something else, I think I touched on this a couple minutes ago, but excellent special teams play from Chris Kreider. He's been a huge part of this over the last couple of years. Obviously, he's always been somewhat of a staple on the Ranger power play, but now, in the last handful of seasons here, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 seasons it's been since Kreider has been a regular on the penalty kill. He's excelled in that role as well. And I think, that's to be expected again this upcoming season. That's part of his game, and that's what he does, and that's what makes him so valuable to this Ranger team. I think also in a best case scenario, Chris Kreider, you can throw Mika in here too in this best case scenario, but they and Kreider specifically find a rapport with Reilly Smith. I mentioned the fact that, Kreider's obviously very fast. Reilly Smith has good speed as well. The two of them could be a lot of fun off the rush. With Smith, I've been kind of lukewarm to the whole thing. There were a couple other players that got one-year deals that I think maybe would have made a little more sense to the Rangers. You don't have to trade a second-round pick to the Penguins and check a few more boxes with some other players. But, Reilly Smith is a good player. He's been a solid player for a long time in the NHL. And between himself and Kreider and Mika, that could be a fun line to watch off of the rush. We'll see how it goes. We know the story by now. Obviously, when you talk about, Kreider and Mika, they're always together on that top line in the right wing, the revolving door. Just this past year, Kakko, Wheeler, Brodzinski, Vesey, Rosovic, Wenberg. I think maybe even Cooley was there for just a very short cameo there for Will Cooley. But, nothing's really stuck. Different amounts of success with different right wingers over the years. And there's times where it looks like maybe this guy or that guy could be the dude going forward to play with Mika and Kreider. And then, of course, it never really materializes. And before you know it, the revolving door keeps revolving, and they've got somebody else with them on that top line. So in a best case scenario, he figures out a way to gel with Reilly Smith. The only kind of downside there is that, Smith is only signed for this upcoming season, and I fully expect this to be a one and done situation with Reilly Smith and the Rangers, one season and then gone, mostly because they have a bunch of players they have to re-sign next year, and Reilly Smith just isn't going to be a priority, I don't think, when next offseason rolls around. But for one season at least, hopefully Kreider can find that rapport with Reilly Smith. I think also in a best-case scenario, we see Chris Kreider, finish a few more checks this season. So he had 99 hits this past year, and that's not a bad amount, especially for somebody that can get by on what he does offensively. But that is the fewest amount of hits that Chris Kreider has ever had in his 12 regular seasons in the NHL. We're not including the first year where he only played 23 regular season games. But beyond that, 99 hits in one season for Kreider, fewest of his career. For his career, though, 1,514 hits for Chris Kreider in 815 games. I would not consider that a small amount. But, with Kreider, and it's not just with hitting and physicality and sticking your nose in there, I feel like he's one of those players that, you're always left wanting a little bit more. I've talked about this with several of the everydayers, the longtime listeners of Locked On New York Rangers. He can be a frustrating player at times, but, this is somebody that does have a really strong all-around game, and somebody that has been a huge part of the Rangers' success over the last couple of seasons and has had some big moments in the playoffs and all that good stuff, but just sticking your nose in there a little bit more. If he's able to do that, finish a few more checks, playing with just a little bit more physicality than we saw last year, I think that would be a good thing for Chris Kreider as well. And again, I get the frustrations with Kreider, but this is somebody that, at times over the years, it's not like he never hits. It's not like he never does anything physical. I mentioned a minute ago how, he sets up shop in the crease and refuses to be moved. So those are all positive things. But a little bit more physicality from Chris Kreider this upcoming season, that would be awesome. I think in a best case scenario as well, we see okay, let's try this word again. Adaptability. There we go. Adaptability from Chris Kreider. Now, as we mentioned, Kreider and Mika, we know this story. They've been line mates for years. They've obviously had a lot of success together, and I do think they're certainly going to start this upcoming season on the same line. But there was a lot of talk this past season when the Rangers were scuffling, namely in January. The idea of maybe splitting up Kreider and Mika, the two of them were not really at the top of their game either. And do you flip-flop a couple of them? Do you go with a top line of Mika and Panarin and Lafreniere? That's always something that could be an option. Do you drop Kreider down to the third line? There's a lot of different things you could do there. But I think in a best-case scenario, you'll see Kreider able to adapt to different situations this upcoming season. There's always one guy that's sort of the swingman in the lineup, or at least one guy that kind of has that role where they can move up the lineup, move down the lineup, whatever it might be. That guy that, kind of ends up playing with a lot of different line mates. And again, I fully expect the top line to be Kreider and Mika and Smith. But if that doesn't work, if something isn't clicking there, then hopefully Kreider can adjust to that if they have to shuffle the deck a little bit. we've seen not so much last year, but the year before that, we saw Kreider get a decent amount of run with Vincent Trocheck, and the two of them, seem to click. They seem to find it more and more as the season progressed there. So that's something that you kind of keep in your back pocket if you'd like to. We'll see how the whole thing unfolds. There's also been some talk of maybe Lafreniere get some time with Mika Zibanejad and Chris Kreider. That could be something that's worth a look. I'd like to see all these things kind of experimented with in the preseason. That's the time to do that and see what works and see what sticks. I'm not really for breaking up the Panarin, Trocheck, and Lafreniere line because they were so good last season. But again, with Kreider, it's something that could happen this upcoming season. If they're scuffling, him and Mika, you could see him with different line mates. And hopefully, in the best case scenario, he's able to adapt when that does happen and maybe even take his game to an even higher level. Sometimes he can almost get too comfortable with the same line mates over and over and over. You play together for so long, for so many years. I think sometimes maybe it just results in you not being on your toes quite enough. And maybe some of that has happened with Kreider and Mika over the years. But yeah, adaptability is going to be big for Chris Kreider if they are to shuffle a deck, at some point this upcoming season. I think also in a best case scenario, he's going to give us, Chris Kreider, that is, a fun story to track this upcoming season. The story's kind of been ongoing for a couple of years now, but, the farther we go with this, the more attention it's going to get. And that is, of course, the storyline of Chris Kreider attempting to become the all-time Ranger leader in goals scored. Now, he's not going to talk about it that much. We know that he's a very team-first guy, and that's just how he is. And, it's one of those things where human nature, it's got to creep into his mind at least a little bit. But again, Kreider tends to be a very team-oriented guy, and I don't think he's going to talk a whole lot about it, but we can certainly talk about it. Chris Kreider is at 304 career goals right now, obviously all of them for the New York Rangers. He is in third place on the Ranger all-time list. Rod Gilbert, of course, in first place with 406 goals, and then Jean Rattel in second place at 336. So Kreider very well could catch Rattel this season. He's only 32 goals behind him. As for Gilbert, Kreider is 102 goals behind Gilbert. So if Kreider, who has 3 years left on his contract, if he is to play out that entire contract with the Rangers, it's going to be exciting. It might be a photo finish. We'll see how it goes. But if Kreider is to catch Gilbert, he would have to average 34 goals per season over the next 3 years with the New York Rangers. Not easy, but certainly doable. And when you look at what Kreider has done in recent seasons, he's gotten more than 34 goals in all of the preceding 3 seasons. 39 goals last year, 36 the year before that, 52 the year before that. So Kreider could absolutely make this happen. And regardless of whether he gets there or not, I think it will be a fun, kind of side note, a storyline for us all to track. Certainly next season and then in seasons to come after that. So yeah, figure we can keep everything moving in just a second. Kreider, I fully expect another really strong season for him with the New York Rangers. There's no reason to think otherwise. As up and down as he can be throughout the course of a season, he's always a steady contributor in a lot of different aspects of the game. And obviously he's going to get on a score sheet quite often. But yeah, we'll continue this series as we go through the offseason. In just a second, though, we're going to shift gears, talk about Matt Rempe and his Fight Club graduation with Georges Laraque. That, was something that happened a short time ago. He was with Laraque for 3 days, and we will discuss that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. Save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. Save even more when you choose a section and let Gametime choose the seats. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, we're going to go ahead and keep everything rolling here. Do want to shift our attention, like I said just a second ago, to Matt Rempe and his Fight Club training with Georges Laraque. And of course, for anybody unfamiliar with Georges Laraque, enforcer of yesteryear, he's 47 years old now, but spent a lot of time in the NHL. I want to say, without looking up his numbers, because we talked about him not too long ago, I think it was about 12 seasons in the NHL for Laraque, and a feared enforcer, but also somebody, that chipped in offensively more than you would think, certainly more than his time on the ice would dictate. But anyway, bottom line, we have kind of an update on that whole situation. Molly Walker recently published a story on everything that happened and how the whole situation came about, because that's kind of a story in and of itself. So basically, Matt Rempe burst onto the scene this past year, makes his NHL debut in the outdoor game, Rangers and Islanders. And as we all know, he gets into a fight like literally half a second into his NHL career with Matt Martin, held his own, did a good job. At the very least, got a draw there. And I would say that, Rempe probably even won that fight. I have to go back and watch it again. But yeah, Rempe certainly held his own at the very least. But, as the games continued, Rempe kept getting into fights, and Laraque was watching along just like all of us were, watching Rempe, again, fight Matt Martin and Delorier of the Flyers, Olivier of the Blue Jackets. And, Rempe did well in those fights, but he also took some shots, and some guys landed some good punches. And, I mean, you guys remember, Rempe was out there at practice, pregame skate. He's got those nasty shiners under his eyes. And this is a quote from Laraque in the article by Molly Walker. This is what Laraque had to say about watching Rempe in those first couple of fights that he got into in the NHL. I was like, oh my God, he's getting hit way too much because he has no technique. And then after a few fights, his face, he had black eyes and everything. After the Olivier fight, when it kind of went a bit bad, I was like, okay, I have to reach out to him because he was so good for the league. And then that's exactly what Laraque did. He reached out to Matt Rempe. The two of them, I guess as the season was progressing, would kind of text each other about fighting. And Rempe was able to put some of those text techniques, I guess we could call them, into action during some of his upcoming fights. He ended up fighting Ryan Reeves. He ended up fighting Curtis McDermott. And the McDermott fight, of course, was part of that whole 5v5 brawl there. But yeah, he held his own in those fights and did well and showed some improved technique when that happened. And Laraque actually offered to meet with Matt Rempe after the season was over. And not long after the season ended, Rempe apparently texted Laraque to ask him if he could take him up on that offer. And they met for 3 days at the Silent Ice Center in Edmonton. They would train for 90 minutes a day, went over a ton of fighting techniques. Per Laraque, it's to ensure the longevity of Rempe's career because Rempe, or rather Laraque, had some concerns about Rempe and how long he could last fighting like that, in his NHL career. When Laraque was first watching Rempe, as all the rest of us were, when Rempe was, first obviously bursting onto the scene there. But they went over everything, all kinds of techniques from removing the helmet to grabbing the jersey to positioning to protecting. They also went over the mental side of fighting a little bit and how to battle kind of the anxiety right before a fight happens and calm yourself down a little bit, before the fight actually occurs, how to prepare your body for a fight. All this was included in the article. And by the way, Laraque did all this for free. Didn't charge Matt Rempe a dime. Apparently was happy to help him, and that's what he did. But in this article, we'll do another quote here from Laraque. This is what he had to say. Wait till you see. I gave him so much information, so much technique. We practiced so much. I can't wait for you to see it. I can't wait. The other thing, too, is they know the whole league knows what he just did. They know he's not going to be the same. And yeah, with Rempe, I mean, you're already facing a very tall task, no pun intended, but he's the tallest player in the NHL, one of the biggest players in the NHL, and obviously he can throw some haymakers, but you add some technique to that, and, you're going to see Matt Rempe as one of the, premier fighters in this league, if he's not that already. But it was interesting to hear Laraque's thoughts on some other things, because obviously, again, he's an enforcer of yesteryear, but he credited Matt Rempe. He doesn't think he's a one-trick pony. He credited him for his speed and his skating ability. Thinks Rempe, with his size and his toughness, is a very important player for the Rangers, and I would certainly agree with that. Another thing that Laraque talked about a little bit here was, he mentioned that he thinks it's good that the NHL is where it is in terms of fighting, where there's a little bit less of that, but he does believe that fighting will always be a part of hockey. And I would agree wholeheartedly on all that. I don't think you need line brawls every night. I don't think you need benches clearing brawls, a couple times a week, whatever the situation might be. But to take fighting completely out of the equation, that to me seems like a bridge too far. It's a way for these guys to, kind of police themselves out there. And it's been around since basically the beginning of time. So I think, fighting in the NHL, it's probably about where it should be right now. And every once in a while, you get one of those crazy brawls, whether it's Rangers Caps from a few years ago or, the line fight to start the Rangers Devils game this past year. And, you get 4 players on each side ejected. You get called back to the old school days of hockey every once in a while, but it doesn't have to happen every night. And, I think fighting is probably about where it should be. But just interesting to, hear all this. And good on Matt Rempe for working on this. Hopefully he's working on other sides of his game, because that was the reaction of some Ranger fans when this story first broke that he was training to fight with Georges Laraque. It was like, oh, come on, you got to work on other things. I think Rempe can work on fighting and also work on some other aspects of his game as well. And I have no doubt that he's going to do that, because very clearly this is somebody that's very highly motivated and wants to carve out a role for himself on this Ranger team this upcoming season. Having said all that, and this is something that I mentioned a few episodes back, but I'll repeat it again here. I do think Rempe should start this upcoming season in the AHL, because there are some aspects of his game. He's talked about wanting to be a better skater, and he's talked about wanting to be able to get more ice time, and he's talked about wanting to be a better defensive forward, and he wants to be part of the penalty kill. Well, these are all things that you can work on very effectively in the AHL. And I know there's people that love Matt Rempe and they want to see him just hit the ground running this upcoming season, and I totally get that too. But he can hone his craft a little bit in the AHL. And then when you need a spark, or you're playing this team or that team and you're expecting some trouble, that's when you call up Matt Rempe and he's ready to go. So it wouldn't be a permanent thing. He'd be back up with the Rangers in no time, but wouldn't mind seeing him play maybe like the first 20% of the season with the AHL and the Hartford Wolfpack, 20 to 25% of the season there. And then you call him up when you need him, and when this team needs a spark, and, somebody that can throw hands a little bit too. So, yep, those are my thoughts on Matt Rempe and the whole training with Georges Laraque. I did want to remind everybody that the Fantasy League, if you played last year, get in touch with me. And you want to come back this year, certainly get in touch with me. If you did not play last year and you'd like to save your spot in line, definitely send me an email or DM me on Twitter. Don't leave in the YouTube comment section. It can very easily get lost in the shuffle. Email or Twitter for sure. You can get in touch with this podcast by sending an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, at @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's at @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.